This is Media Sales Mastery, the podcast for media sales professionals. In each episode, we bring you information, insights, and ideas from some of the industry's top thought leaders. Connect with us to help pick the topic and guide the show.
This is Media Sales Mastery, the podcast for media sales professionals. I'm your host, Jamie Wood, and we are back with part 2 of our 2-part series around brief to pitch. Our returning guest is Lena Rapley. Let's jump into that right now.
The first 5.
Lena, welcome.
Good morning.
Hey, so Lena, is it just me, or does the average brief response time feel like it's getting shorter and shorter each year? Do you think that, less time is actually the thing that's driving that, or do you think that it's just that the requirements and expectations around the sophistication of a response is actually increasing?
I feel like there's so much that goes into that question. We speak a bit about those good old days like 10, 15 years ago when things felt a lot slower and you were able to spend a decent amount of time on working with your clients on what solutions look like. I think there's a couple of different flows that happen within our world. The first one is when you're on the media side of things and you're working with clients and brands and agencies and they supply you a brief. What we find these days, I think, is that they're really clear on what they want their outcome to be. They've already done a lot of that groundwork and that due diligence, so they can afford to give us shorter timelines so that we can work on just what the end solution looks like. So that reactive brief process, sure, feels like that's really shortened. I think where there's a real opportunity is in that proactive brief space. So I do believe that there's still opportunity in market to drive those longer term discussions, be able to work really in depth with your clients to get that longer turnaround time, really dive into what strategy and what the expectations are and how you can solve those business problems to deliver, great campaign ideas which lead on to brilliant results. I think the other area that's really interesting to consider is certainly, the increase of media solutions and options that there are in market now. I feel like back in the day, having come from an audio and radio background, working with you, Jamie, now being in total TV, at that point in time, we were really led by longer term planning, which kicked off with TV first. I think we spoke a lot in market about, those TV logs are open, so the briefs are starting to come through. And then as traditional planners, people would then start to look at what their next kind of media placements would look like after TV. Maybe it was out of home because out of home had a longer lead time. And then lo and behold, radio tended to be one of those ones that still always had a bit more of a shorter lead time. I think what we're finding in industry now is that that's had a massive shift as well. And so that flow and effect really impacts those reactive briefs.
Media Sales Mastery.
So we've received and interrogated the brief. It's time for assembling people for the brief huddle and the brainstorm. Can you talk a little bit about how to set that room and that process up for success?
I think in this case, it's really considering how you can get the best out of people from a creativity standpoint. I think I've mentioned earlier or in the other episode, certainly around how some people differ in terms of needing a bit of time to digest information versus ones that are able to think and do better being on the fly. So you first off need to have a plan in place around how you can provide people the information that's going to both allow them to have some planning time if they need it, or at the same time, if they're those ones in the room that are able to just pick up what you're putting down, you need to be able to brief really succinctly in the room so that everyone knows what they're working towards and they're able to creatively have that discussion. The other area which is really important is ensuring that you've got a clear facilitator for the room. Creative facilitation and brainstorm facilitation is a real skill. It's a skill set fully unto its own, and we could have a whole probably podcast talking about that. But it's really ensuring that you've got the right people who are able to get the best out of people in the room. There's a lot of, conversation around that yes and mentality, how you can add to ideas, but then also at the end of a brief or brainstorm discussion, it's being able to refine what that solution looks like, build it down, and make sure that it's really ticking the boxes in terms of that brief itself.
It's interesting too, because often there is a bit of urgency to get that room together quickly after you've got the interrogated brief. And it does create a bit of pressure because in an ideal world, you would actually love to have mined some insights, time to receive and review research, things that are going to actually help inform and inspire the room to shape the solution. I guess with time constraints, it might be a luxury that maybe you aren't afforded. What do you do in this situation? Do you retrofit research to the idea that you've come up with? Do you kind of backsell the idea, or is there a little bit of a process to arrive really quickly at the insight before you go into the room?
Well, I think any salesperson can be a strategist and pull out some insights and really tailor that back to what the solution looks like. So never be afraid to you yourself really help position and steer how that solution is going to work for that brief, for that client and brand. But I do think it comes back to understanding what your client really values in the room. If they value that creative idea and the sizzle, they don't necessarily need a strategic insight. It's just about linking it back to how that solves the brief that they've provided you. If they are someone who's more data-driven or numbers-driven, then maybe you might need to just have a quick look to see whether or not you can back up and support some of your ideas and solutions with either audience data or kind of one key insight that you're able to help build a narrative from.
My kind of favorite thing in these scenarios is if you don't have an insight, it's actually a really good way to warm up the room in a brainstorm. There's always so much pressure to just start going into ideation mode or trying to kind of jump into what are some concepts that we could come up with. And usually just actually kind of talking about the product or the category in the room and taking that pressure off, you can start to kind of organically arrive at the insight. And I know, that's sort of easier said than done, but it's usually just a case of like, here's the product. Does anyone actually use this product? Has anyone actually bought this in the past? Why did you buy it? What does it do? What's your experience with it? What's your reason for buying it? That can be a really great way to get a brainstorm cranking, rather than it feeling like you have to then start forcing straight out the gate, concepts or ideas that that you could then sort of craft into a solution.
100%. I mean, we're all consumers ourselves, so we're the perfect case study to bounce off in terms of what we would do with that product or that brand and how they could appeal and connect with us.
Here's my favorite topic of convo: process conflict and internal pushbacks from departments. So high stakes, short-term brief response, it's going to be inevitable that a few departments will have some issues, whether it's just, not being able to deliver part of the response on the timeline or to the quality required, or flat out like pushing back, and maybe even like in some cases accusing you of subverting the process when, you're trying to get those efficiencies. How do you kind of navigate this messy stuff, Lena? How does it typically play out, and how do you recommend somebody kind of works through it?
I think over time you end up being able to build out a bit of a portfolio of what solutions look like for you to work with. I think in those moments it's about being proactive, being able to have conversations and understanding what the challenges are, being really empathetic with your work colleagues. I mean, we're all there in the work environment to come and do our best work every day, but we all work in different roles and have different KPIs. So I think this comes back to just being a really great colleague and being able to discuss and understand what's going on in their world. Now, when it comes to the actual solution itself and kind of having that, I guess, that pre-work or that bank of ideas or solutions or things that you've worked on in the past, there could be opportunities to discuss, hey, could this be a potential solution? We've gone to market with this in the past. I feel like we could leverage or tweak or enhance this in some way. Is there a way that, I can work with you on being able to help kind of complete what that task looks like while still generating a new idea and a solution that's going to fit your brief at the same time?
Yeah, it's such a vague question I'm asking too, because there's a lot of different ways that this will actually manifest, and often it's unique, right? It might be you need a talent approval, in which case it's a 3 to 5 day turnaround to contact stakeholders. In other cases, it might be that there's a particular template or briefing process that has to occur, which, through the process of just everybody wanting to kind of arrive at that end outcome, maybe somebody has actually missed a key step in the process. I think to me, this kind of stuff might be negated around, what you said in an earlier episode around like properly socializing the brief and contextualizing the brief when you receive it, almost like giving people the heads up so that if and when these types of things come up, they're not coming up completely out of the blue, or there isn't that prior context around the brief.
For sure. Again, I think it comes back to being a really good work colleague and being the advocate for your client and the brand within the business at the same time. So reaching out early, being really clear on comms from, what a win looks like, ensuring that you've interrogated the brief, just making sure that you've been able to tick off all your sides of the workflow so that you can set up the rest of the business for success is certainly a way that you can also just show the passion that you have behind what this workflow looks like within the business and how you can, really lean in and you want to be able to support your colleagues at the same time.
Okay, so let's say we've gotten all the elements, we've gotten all the approvals, everything has gone through the process, and now we're at the stage, Lena, where we're pulling the solution together. And you're often obviously getting disparate pieces of information, different pieces of collateral, different approvals. How do you collate this all? What's your approach to building out that narrative, for the way you're going to sell the idea of the solution? And then how do you sort of curate and populate the right information into that?
I think the first thing you need to consider is to what level of detail do you need to respond with for your client? So whether it's a full presentation, whether or not you need to do the schematic or the schedule with all the cost details, whether or not you need additional support material, all of those elements can kind of get started almost at the same time, and you can chip away at what those look like. When it comes to the sell, from a traditional market sense, we typically do have some form of presentation where we take people through slides. Over the years, I've really come to value having very clear headlines. Headlines on the slide, minimal information to really tell that narrative and that story. And there does tend to be a few different ways that you can tell a narrative and a story with the presentations, whether that be idea first, wow with the idea, and then support with those additional insights or key points of data, or reflecting on the brief, identifying a strategic opportunity or area, and then looking at the solution off the back of it. So there's kind of 2 or 3 different ways that you'd typically be able to build out that narrative. And from there, once you have an understanding of how you can do that, I guess it's bringing it back to the brief and being able to really nail those headlines and looking for the information that you're able to supplement within those slides. I think the final piece is that at times within the industry over the years, I'm sure, Jamie, we've all seen it. You might be by the printer and you see a presentation that's been printed off and every slide has 200 words and you're thinking, gosh, not necessarily the best use of PowerPoint these days. There's actually a bit of safety in less is more, because you can always VO or speak over to some of the detail when you're presenting. And I think that can really also allow you to be quite dynamic when it comes to pulling together those final bits of narrative if you're waiting on information. And it really looks like it's not necessarily impacting your pitch in the room because it hasn't been verbally written out all over a slide. You're using it as support for that overarching narrative.
Yeah, and it's just human nature to want to fill it with information. I think that's just a natural tendency where, you want to mount the most compelling argument possible in order to answer the brief, secure the revenue. And particularly when you have a multifaceted solution like this, where the stakes are so high, like winning and losing can mean the difference between a quarterly budget, a quarterly share target, an opportunity to potentially kind of hit your own personal revenue target. The pressure is even higher. And this is where I'm kind of curious for your perspective around what kind of information do you need to prioritize versus what stuff do you have to be comfortable that you're going to omit from the proposal?
One thing that's absolutely necessary and something that has become, I think, a lot more obvious in more recent years is the more that you can clearly outline and showcase how you've met the goals of the brief, the better you're going to be set up for success in terms of, obviously nailing the brief, but being able to get feedback and asking questions from your clients or agencies as to where you sit within that consideration process. So that's an absolute must. And traditionally that would sit either at the top of or towards the end of what your proposal looks like. And then I think it comes back to that overarching yes, goal of the brief, but how you've been able to kind of creatively bring that to life and how you've been able to, I guess, connect with their comms platform, what you're doing from a marketing perspective in terms of considering their media and marketing objectives like within the funnel, how both your platform and that product element hits those objectives. And then also, I guess, how you can, what the next steps are, like what is the follow-up process, how are we going to get on the same page here, how can we work together as partners to really refine down and finesse what the solution looks like.
I guess that's, when you're talking about refining the solution and trying to finesse it, like I'd love to know a little bit about that stress testing process. Like, how do you make sure the final solution is as good as it can possibly be? How do you ensure you're not missing something, that you've got alignment around what is actually being sold, which I think is a big one. How do we make sure that what we're representing to the client is something we actually feel confident we can deliver? What does that kind of look like in your world? Is there a particular process or technique that you recommend?
Yeah, well, I feel like we might be erring a little bit, certainly towards the end of pitch and into what that next stage looks like from an implementation perspective. There's certainly a bit of grey area there in terms of process. I have found over the years the best moments in working with clients is actually being able to pitch out the proposal, and then before things are finalised, actually almost have that kickoff call or that implementation meeting to really refine down and work with the client as to how we can bring to life the goals of their campaign, but certainly their creative nuances and how we integrate those through what that product solution looks like. If you're working with agencies, it's certainly about trying to get yourself as a media owner, the agency, the client, and potentially the creative agency all in that one room, so you can almost break down what the solution looks like and then recreate it, rebuild it back up with all the other considerations and factors that everyone has, which are their own KPIs within that whole process.
I love that. Let's jump into the listener question.
I can't ask my sales manager that.
Full disclosure, it's kind of like the same question that we got last time, just kind of asked in a different way. So it's clearly a bit of a consistent thing that's coming up here. Here it is now.
Hey Jamie, the company I work for seems to always have a misalignment between our internal timelines versus what the clients require. I'm constantly getting wrapped over the knuckles by internal teams for asking for things urgently. How do you address this?
So this one is sort of similar to the last one, which was around internal timelines and what's feasible for departments to deliver, their internal elements. But it sounds to be like this is a case of a sales process maybe not feeling customer-centric. What's your initial interpretation of what's going on here?
It never ceases to shock me how so many of the challenges we face in the workplace really just come back to communication, managing expectations, and working hard on having internal relationships, being able to and understand that everyone has their own KPIs, being empathetic to conversations, asking questions, and then also listening at the same time. So you can take on board all of that information to, make the right recommendation within that workflow and within that process. So I have mentioned this before, but I'm going to say it again because it's so important. The salesperson who tends to be the key kind of project manager for any chunky pieces of work that come into a media business, it's really your opportunity to set the tone and style, to have that positive energy and to be able to, lift up who you're working with both internally and externally on this key piece of business in this project. Energy goes a long way, and that positive mindset and that constructive kind of mindset goes a long way in terms of problem solving and being able to bring people on board with what that journey looks like. And then the final piece is just over the years, you do end up being able to create a bit of your own personal Bible from what a solution or process perspective could look like. It's being able to understand when you need to tap into those moments to help support your team around you, to ensure that you're getting that balance of, getting a really good quality solution out from a business perspective, but that you're still really being able to meet the objectives from the brief and being able to deliver something to the client that you're proud of at the same time.
It's been really interesting thinking about this from the perspective of when you actually just have like a market standard, like the competitors might set the tone that this is a reasonable time frame to respond to a brief at the level required. And I would say you're exactly right with this. It's, as a salesperson, you are the person who has the insight into the customer and their world and what's required to actually be competitive in the marketplace. So to me, if this is a recurring issue, I feel like this is also something where you just have to really articulate this in a non-emotional way where it's not accusatory, but something just to the effect of, like, we're consistently seeing that this is the expectation from our customers. It seems to me that our competitors are accommodating of this request, and we actually just need to collectively work together to go, how do we preempt this, this in future, and how do we find some efficiencies to work together to streamline this process? Like, this is not necessarily an interdepartmental issue. It's more of I guess, a business challenge, if you will.
Yeah. And look, I think in those situations, it's about, I guess, being prepared and wanting to be able to sit down and understand what's going on in everyone's world, to really, I guess, break down and understand where the key roadblocks are so that you can work together on smoothing those out. I think in those moments as well, it's really important, especially from a media salesperson perspective, to be able to come to those conversations with examples. It's great having anecdotal market feedback, but you certainly want to be able to showcase how this comes to life in the real world. And I've found over the years, especially working with creative types, it's an amazing way to really be able to show the impact or the level that you're working in market, because there is a bit of a delayed, I guess, response to being able to find out whether or not your competitors are putting things together differently. There's time frames when it comes to pitching a market and then things finally coming to life that can take anywhere between 3 to 6 months. So you want to be able to compile, I guess, that evidence to be able to show, this is the next level that we should be pushing and driving towards, and being able to show to them where we'd like to go to from a goal perspective, understanding what you can do to support, their teams in terms of smoothing out processes so that we can all kind of level up together.
Such a good point. And I think, that whole idea of, I really do want to see the data and the evidence. I think that is so important, to actually be able to then put that argument forward. Like, something that is a trend I see with a lot of media salespeople is we tend to speak in hyperbole. We tend to kind of use like a lot of these big bombastic kind of, we're very attuned to kind of selling externally in a particular way. And then when we try to point that internally, it doesn't necessarily land, right? So you can't be saying things like, we're going to lose these briefs and we're going to lose revenue and our competitors are really smashing us in market. Like, you have to kind of be able to articulate that in a very rational, very logical, sound business case with documented examples, and make it a shared issue rather than you guys aren't playing ball. Because to your great point, the first step here is having a bit of empathy and understanding. Is it a resourcing issue? Is it, is it a lack of the proper kind of workflow or process? Is it that expectations maybe need to be reset? Like, there's a lot of complexity that sits behind this. Very rarely do you find a department that overtly works against the sales function, although it can definitely feel like that at times. It's very rare that it's ever somebody there setting out to deliberately make life hard for sales or to block revenue.
100%. And look, I really feel for and have felt for those integration or content teams in the past, because they have the absolute pleasure of having two big key stakeholders that they work with every single day, which is typically your salespeople, who, yes, are keeping their client needs kind of first when they bring them into the business. But then on the flip side, their other big stakeholder is either content or editorial, and they're all about the business audiences, right? So just imagine being in that push and pull of really being in the center of trying to balance what the business's audience's needs are versus how we can get what the client needs from a marketing perspective, and essentially, from a sales perspective, get revenue into that business at the same time. So, they have a lot on their plate that you need to be considerate of.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I would say it's actually one of the most difficult interdepartmental dynamics to have to manage when you have, to be that conduit between those two key vital arms of the business. And a lot of that does come down to the companies where you see it really working are where you have a really strong level of protection and respect for the audience from sales, and you have a really acute commercial awareness from the content arm. That's where you can start to see these kind of winning cultures. When you start having, polarization of those two functions, I could imagine, particularly for somebody who's a conduit between the two, that would just be hell on earth coming to work every day.
Yes. I think we've all seen that at moments in time.
Hey, it's been so good talking to you about this. I'm glad we had time to unpack this over two episodes as well, Lena. I guess the only thing I would ask you is, is there any sort of parting thought, or I guess is there one sort of tip or takeaway that you would recommend the audience take away and try to apply immediately, this week when it comes to this whole brief to pitch world?
Look, I've said it and I'll say it again. Anyone can be a strategist. All you need to do is take a bit of time, do a bit of research, and really think about how you can apply your product to be able to create solutions that are going to drive results for your clients. And at the same time, you can also be creative. I think creativity really fuels our industry. Don't be scared to be creative. And even if, an idea lands flat in a brainstorm room, you never know where that idea can actually trigger someone else's amazing creative idea. So back yourself in those two areas. You're more than just a salesperson title. You can be strategic and creative and work with your clients to really deliver those amazing results.
I love it. Lena, thank you so much. It's been great to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks so much.